Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm talking to someone that knows a lot about managing risk. Richard Fenning has spent 3 decades advising multinational companies on geopolitics and security crises. He's been involved in helping to manage situations involving kidnappings, terrorist attacks, coup d'etat, corruption scandals, cyber attacks, earthquakes and hurricanes in places ranging from Iraq and Russia to Colombia and Nigeria. Richard is the former CEO of Control Risks, a global consultancy that specialises in, as they describe it, helping businesses out of tight spots in difficult countries. And of course, when companies get into tight spots, and indeed when countries are difficult, that's usually because there are humans creating the tight spots or making the difficulty. So this is, pun intended, the perfect territory for exploring human risk. And Richard has just written a book called What on Earth Can Go Wrong? Tales from the Risk Business, in which he shares stories from his time in the field. It's a really fun and informative read, so I knew that I wanted to get him onto the show. In our discussion, we explore how Richard came to work in this field. After all, it's not something most of us would grow up thinking of as a career, and what his experience has taught him about managing risk, professionally and personally. As you'll hear, he's not only got some great stories to tell, but he does so in a very human and engaging way. So I know that you're really going to enjoy this conversation with Richard Fenning as he tells his tales from the risk business. Richard, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. It's a great pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here. And I'd like to start the conversation just by having you tell my listeners a little bit about how you got into the field that you ended up in.
Almost entirely by accident is the very short answer, but let me just elaborate a little bit. I started work initially after going to university. I started work in the accounting profession, and within probably a maximum of 5 seconds of starting that in that world, I realized that it wasn't for me. After about 6.5 seconds, my employer realized it probably wasn't for me as well. So what ensued was a sort of elaborate dance where we both agreed that this wasn't the right career for me. I moved into more mainstream consulting work. And then around the end of my 20s, about age 29, I saw an advert in the newspaper for what was described as a political risk consulting business. And I thought, that sounds so much more interesting than what I'm doing. I have absolutely no earthly idea what it is, but it sounds funky. I've got a history degree. That's the world for me. So I applied and they employed me. And I spent the next 3 decades there at a firm called Control Risks, which is in the risk, intelligence, security space, and was fortunate enough to become chief executive and spent 14 years running that firm during a period in which it expanded, both in terms of what it did and where it was around the world geographically. So it was an extremely fortuitous glance at the Sunday Times job section in about 1992 that serendipitously led me into that world.
I love that. And the bit I particularly love, particularly when you talk about it in the book, is that you're very honest around that. There's lots of people that would create a sort of with hindsight narrative. And I love the fact that serendipity has sort of formed a key part of your career choice. I wonder, could you just unpick for my listeners a little bit about what control risk does? So I think we all understand theoretically there are tons of risks out there. We get what politics is. What sort of things would you be hired to do?
Right. So in broad terms, every business in the world faces a kind of gamut of risks that obviously range financial, economic, fiscal, and the slice of the risk spectrum that Control Risk deals with is around security and geopolitics and kind of human integrity, really. The likelihood of being defrauded, of being hacked, of getting embroiled in some kind of corruption situation, plus all the kind of physical risks that manifest themselves for businesses, obviously in faraway, scary places, but actually What has happened in the last few years is that distinction between nice, safe markets that we all kind of understand, like where we are. I'm sitting in central London this morning, and kind of far away, scary places like Iraq or Afghanistan or places we see on the news. That distinction has blurred completely. And technology has also blurred it. You can be hacked. You can be compromised from a cyber point of view anywhere in the world. So that is the general universe that control risk occupies. And it does a couple of things, broadly speaking. It heightens people's awareness and understanding of their own specific vulnerabilities against that range of risks, and recommends and helps implement strategies and programs and trainings and other forms of sort of defensive measures that companies should take in order to kind of fulfill their duty of care to protect themselves and the value and the brand of the organization. And then it also kind of leaps into action when something has gone wrong. And that could be almost anything. It could be the finance director's run off with all the money. Some scary teenage cyber hackers have just held the company to kind of ransom. It could be that somebody's been abducted. It could be almost anything where the physical integrity, the safety, the brand of the organization is suddenly in threat. And what they need is that sensible, sober, reassuring, seasoned kind of expertise in managing through difficult crises. And that happens, of course, all over the world. And that's the crazy world that I spent a very long time flying around the world in.
And it's fascinating reading the book, because there really is a sort of smorgasbord, is probably the wrong word, but I'll use it anyway, of experiences and locations. And the way you depicted it there, I very, very much the antithesis of audit in some respects, which is sort of a regular repeat thing, is you presumably you never quite know what's coming next. So you could be dealing in the list of countries, is it almost the types of issues as you've highlighted is also quite broad.
Yeah, yes. So the appeal of that world to work in is the unpredictability and the fact that there's often a direct correlation between some of the stuff you read in the newspaper headlines when you wake up in the morning and what your day is going to be filled with. Having said that, there are patterns to the kinds of risks and the kind of problems that companies face. And there are patterns and techniques to the solutions that you can deploy. So it's not complete anarchy. There is a rhythm and a rhyme to how the business works and how particular countries will suddenly be both opportunity rich and problem rich. And so there are kind of patterns to how the work evolves, and you need that because you're kind of making, like any other business, you're planning for what you anticipate your clients will need in the years ahead. So where you are in the world, the kind of people you hire, the kind of training and expertise they develop, you have to have some sort of predictive capability. It's not, and the book probably for sort of somewhat for a dramatic purpose probably makes out slightly excessively that one just wakes up randomly in the world and is suddenly bombarded with a host of insanely difficult to solve problems and gallantly set off Jedi-like to try and do it. There are certainly bits of that, but looking back on it, you can see kind of waves of activity moving around the world as the global economy, the kind of global kind of geopolitical situation sort of evolves. So the Arab Spring happens. There's going to be a whole bunch of things that need doing in the Middle East. We randomly go and invade Iraq and decapitate Saddam Hussein, and then suddenly realize that we don't entirely know what's going to happen next. There's a sort of predictability in hindsight that there's going to be a surge in activity, or a series of kind of major corporate scandals and frauds occur in different markets. The regulator's going to start sort of trying to, in many cases, often bolt the stable door after the horse has bolted, and that's going to cause all sorts of kind of issues for clients. And new markets come into vogue and they go out of vogue. And I talk in the book about, places like Iran and Myanmar, they all have their moment in the sun as the next great big huge emerging market full of opportunity, and people rush at it with enormous enthusiasm and bags of other people's money ready to buy things. And then the sort of political fault lines shift, and everybody's running in the opposite direction. And there's a sort of the value of an organization like Control Risk, and what made it fun is that there's lots to do on the way into new markets, and there's lots to do getting people out of markets that have suddenly gone sour on them.
Sort of the way you depict that, I mean, a lot of the words that you use, you put in the categories as sort of the average person on the street would say, that sounds incredibly dangerous. I mean, you're operating in some interesting locations. Very often there will be people that will want to prevent you doing the thing that you're doing. And so it sounds quite a risky endeavor. So I'm sort of intrigued by your thoughts on and how does one adjust to a world that isn't on the face of it as predictable as one might think, and how does Control Risks think about managing its own risks in that sense?
So there are moments when it's risky, and it would be wrong to say otherwise. Just because you are often going to places at times of sort of a rather unpredictable change, and the capacity for kind of violence or kind of aggressive government intervention is kind of always there. Having said that, this is not. There is nothing to be gained by a sort of gung-ho sort of addiction to kind of peril and danger, and it isn't that. It's about, yes, being in the right place at the right time to help people who kind of need you there. There's no point if the client has a huge problem in the Niger Delta or the oil fields of Iraq or the jungles of Colombia. There's no point trying to do that from central London or Manhattan or Tokyo or somewhere. You need to be where the issue is, and these places are inherently unstable and dangerous in many cases. The reality is there's lots of things you can do as an individual and as an organization to make sure that you're not taking unnecessary risks. And if you're there advising on those risks, the last thing you want to do is become a victim of those risks yourself. Otherwise, the advice you're giving is useless. So yes, during the course of a nearly 30-year career there, I did find myself in some uncomfortable places at times. But nearly all of the time, I felt that I was taking sensible risks, I was taking sensible precautions, and I was with people that I trusted not to put us unduly in harm's way.
Do you think the world is getting riskier, or do we just have a greater awareness of it?
It is harder to predict how and where risk is going to affect us. Is the world getting riskier? On aggregate, no, it's not. The world that we live in our corner of the world, is by any measure safer than it's ever been in the history of our time on this planet, in terms of our ability to live lives largely free of the things that beset for hundreds of thousands of years our ancestors. That's not that helpful a fact if what you're reading in the newspaper every day is a sense that the world that we kind of imagined in our childhood to exist is sort of crumbling around us. So me saying, well, we're much safer than we were as factory workers in the 19th century is not a hugely helpful piece of information. It's nevertheless true, but it's not a hugely helpful piece of information. And what we're living in, of course, is a world in which we are force-fed a constant diet of all the sort of pestilence and peril that besets the world, and the sort of fragility of the world. And of course, what's happened over the last 14 months or so with the COVID-19 pandemic and the awfulness that has caused right across the world heightens that sense that people have that we're living on a sort of perilous edge all the time. And the reality is, actually, we're not. We have the capacity with modern medicine to be able to ultimately mitigate and get over these kind of situations. But nevertheless, it fosters a sense in people of sort of ongoing anxiety. And I think that's the reality, is the world is volatile, it's unpredictable, it's changing, the sort of tectonic plates of kind of politics and how countries are governed and who's up and who's down. That is all going through, I'm sure, a period of profound change. And it has done in the past, but in the past, it wouldn't have affected our daily lives, or we wouldn't have been exposed to it in the way we are now. And so risk has taken on, I think, in the sort of kind of psychological makeup, in the sort of neuro makeup of people, this sense of a world at risk has become a kind of key part of our sort of psychological makeup, I think, in a way that possibly it wasn't.
And you talked earlier about predictability. And so on the one hand, what you've just described is we all tend to think, didn't see that coming. And yet there are, if we look at history, patterns that repeat themselves. And I'm fascinated about how you go about that approach of if you're trying to have a fairly standardized set of operating procedures that will give you the security and safety you need to be able to solve some of these problems, and the clarity of vision around some of these issues. How do you start to see the predictability in the thing that feels unpredictable in the moment?
With enormous difficulty, actually. And risk management, or kind of risk analysis, and kind of creating a register of risks for an organization is now a very commonplace practice, and it's obviously compulsory in a lot of industries, particularly those that are regulated, and yet it's very difficult to get people to focus accurately on a sort of sober appreciation of what potentially could go wrong, not trying to be all-seeing, omnipotent, able to see around the corner. We can't obviously see around corners. Biologically, we cannot see around corners. And so in a sense, there's no point sort of excessively trying to divine the unknowable. But there are lots of very practical things people can do about making sure that what might happen to an organization is kind of properly calibrated. And you look at the COVID situation. It wasn't a black swan. It wasn't one of these things that suddenly occurs in our world, and we kind of think, "Oh my word, why didn't we spot that?" We had spotted it. We'd had dry runs at it, or not so dry runs at it in Asia. The government had practiced pandemic response plans, albeit probably more for an influenza style outbreak rather than something different that was highly asymptomatic in many cases. But nevertheless, the idea that some infectious disease could spread around the world and seriously disrupt kind of normal life, hugely disrupt the economy is a known thing, right? So it happened 100 years ago, and with the Spanish flu, killed more people than the First World War. We've forgotten about it, and we obsess about the First World War, and we forgot about the thing that came immediately afterwards and killed all of us.
It's a very good point.
These are not hidden facts. These are in the what Donald Rumsfeld would have described as known knowns. We kind of knew this happened, and we knew it could happen again, and yet we chose somehow to downplay the likelihood of that happening. And the psychology of why we do that fascinates me.
And I mean, you mentioned Rumsfeld, who at the time of making those statements was sort of quite widely pilloried. And yet, as I look at it, I think with hindsight, it strikes me that what he said was actually quite intelligent, and that looking at the world through that lens is not unhelpful. I wonder what you thought of that.
Yes, I'm trying to remember the context in which he said it. I think he might have been trying to justify the fact that decapitating the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq led to absolute anarchy and chaos. And I think that was probably fairly predictable. I think he might have been trying to justify the fact that it had all gone horribly wrong on the basis that who could have ever have known that? Well, you, Donald, for starters, might have been able to figure that out. You were by that stage a seasoned international politician who dealt over many years with the Middle East, so you kind of knew you should have known what you were getting into. Anyway, it's not the time or place for a discussion of Donald Rumsfeld and other people's culpability in what happened in Iraq. But yes, it is in many ways it's a helpful acknowledgement that we can only deal with the cards that are in front of us, and to spend too long in conjecture about things that may never happen is it's not futile, but it's a process of diminishing returns. I'm also mindful of what I now work as an executive coach in London, and one of my colleagues here always quotes the saying that 99% of the things we worry about will never happen to us, and they won't happen to us because we worry about them. So there is some wisdom in worry. There is some purpose to worry. We do it for a reason. It may feel that sort of 3 a.m. in the morning when we wake up and we've got something on our mind, we can't get back to sleep because we're agitated. It may feel like an entirely negative process. But I think neurologically what we're doing is sort of deep in the recesses of the computer that sits in our head, we are trying to figure out a solution to it. On the surface, it manifests itself as anxiety and angst and fretting and what seems like very negative and unnecessary feelings. But I think what is happening deep inside the machine is something very beneficial.
That's one extremity. The other extremity is to sort of ignore problems and pretend that they're never going to. So willful blindness as a good example. And it does seem to me, as you're talking, that we've equipped ourselves to recognize that risk is there. And we have various personal mechanisms for dealing with it, one of which is one extremity overly concerned, the other one is to ignore it completely. And clearly, probably the smartest approach was somewhere in the middle. And as I ponder that, I was wondering how your personal perspective on risk has shifted as a result of what you've done. And so in your personal life, how you think about managing risk. Clearly, it will have changed the way you do that. But I'm intrigued as to your thoughts as to what that might have done to you.
Yes, I think, and I write about this in the book, I think it's been through an arc. I think doing the work I did and going to the places I did, I think over time made me a tiny bit braver, or made me more able to distinguish what is risky and what isn't, and what my tolerance for it was, and probably discovered over time that my tolerance was slightly higher than I thought it was. As I no longer do it, I probably feel that some of that has faded. What I've observed is people who spend a lot of time very close to danger, very close to other people's suffering. So I'm thinking of emergency relief workers, I'm thinking of war correspondents, I'm thinking of peacekeeping troops in very difficult parts of the world. I think somehow, often, close proximity to danger has an addictive quality. And I think it also has the quality sometimes of desensitizing people to danger. And I've noticed people who spend a lot of time in those kind of environments often talk about themselves in the third person, as if they somehow have kind of looking at themselves from the outside, as if it's not actually them that's doing those things. That never happened to me. I think whilst I became more comfortable and in some ways more willing to go places and see things and experience a little bit of proximity to danger, I never felt desensitized to it. And looking back on it, I don't feel desensitized to it. But there is definitely that, it didn't happen to me, but there is definitely that trend that I've seen in people whereby they find they find close proximity to peril an integral part of what makes them kind of get up in the morning and go. And there is something about taking risks that is the rocket fuel of what drives human beings on. And I talk in the book, or I create an imaginary scenario back in time in the book where people first decided to start going to hunt mammoths. It's an insanely dangerous thing to do, and I've never. Obviously, none of us have ever done it, but you don't have to.
It doesn't seem like a particularly simple thing to do.
No. So what's the choice? You can stay near the cave, eat berries, drink puddle water, and kind of get by, collect firewood, and kind of get by, or a group of you go off on this insanely dangerous thing, knowing that some of you are going to get trampled to death by a mammoth, but you're going to come back with enormous amounts of protein that's going to make our brains grow bigger, that's going to give us the wherewithal to really start society's kind of progress. And that was that impulse, I think, to make that trade-off. And what it also gave people, I'm sure, and I'm just making this up because I've never lived in a cave and I've never seen a mammoth. But I think it gave us that sense of sort of euphoric teamwork, that sense that working together we can overcome, we can do things beyond our individual capabilities, we can take risks for purpose, we can take risks for progress. And I think that is wired into human beings in many ways, in a very atavistic, deep-seated, from centuries and centuries and centuries ago kind of way. And because our lives are so essentially safe now, we have to create artificial stimulation to keep on going back to that kind of dopamine hit of risk taking. It's why people jump out of airplanes. It's why people go base jumping. It's why people ski recklessly down mountains with avalanche risk. It's why all of those things that we've kind of created. It's not for idle purpose. It's an attempt, I think, to try and recreate things from our deep past that actually as a species drove us forward. And things that actually are quite dangerous, like crossing the road or texting whilst driving or taking too many prescription medicines, all the things that eating too much, all the things that sort of beset the modern world, we kind of diminish. And we're looking for that adrenaline hit, that dopamine hit that we get, that chemical response from putting ourselves in danger. Texting whilst driving doesn't create the same chemical stimulus in the brain that doing much more physically dangerous things does. And I'm fascinated again by how that sort of weaves its way through modern life.
I'm intrigued by your personal risk appetite. So you talked about the fact that you're not a sort of I guess a sort of danger junkie, for want of a better phrase. But how do you look at your sort of personal risk profile in terms of the sorts of things that you do and how you look at the world? Do you think you're more risk averse than you were? Are you less? How do you manage those dynamics personally?
I think I'm probably a little less risk averse than I used to be. It's probably just a function of kind of age and objectivity. But I think I have a good appreciation of why people need to do it and why people should do it. And I think one of the features of the modern world, and I'm straying into massive overgeneralization territory here, so take this with that caveat, is a temptation amongst a lot of people in our comfortable society that to take a risk is a negative thing. And I think for younger people, taking a risk, and I don't mean a physical risk, I mean starting a business, moving abroad, turning your back on the prospect of a kind of safe and predictable life to go and do something that's more experimental. the temptation to not do those things because we have somehow programmed ourselves to retreat to safety and predictability, I think isn't a good feature necessarily of the modern world. And that sense of adventure, that sense of experimentation, that sense of being willing to go somewhere, do something without any, or with a diminished sense of the potential negative consequences, I think is a healthy strand of what makes societies successful and progressive. Now, taken to an extreme, and wars start, and countries get invaded, and sort of undesirable things happen. But that basic impulse in us to resist the comfortable and the predictable, I wonder if sometimes reading kind of media reports of things that have gone wrong and the kind of public outcry manifested itself by the people who write newspapers that something must be done to stop people walking on railway lines, or to stop people going. There's a report in the paper last week about some ultra marathon in China where 20 people died because the weather turned bad. Now, if those 20 people died completely unnecessarily and negligently, then that's one thing. But the impulse for people to want to go and do insane running races through the mountains of China carries inherent risk in it. What do we do as a society? It goes wrong, so we say we can never do this again. And I just question whether that's the right mindset for a successful society.
And I find that fascinating, because I think the way you talk about risk is it's seen as something to be eliminated. We need to mitigate. We can't have this bad. So we focus on the thing we don't want to have happen. We don't focus on the potential good that actually giving people a bit of liberty allows them to. And I was thinking back to my own career, and I qualified as an accountant. I'm probably the last person you should have putting a set of accounts together nowadays. But that was a sensible career choice. And nobody, so everybody nods, says it was a very good choice. But you look back and say, well, what would the alternative career path have looked like? And you're right, it was, in some respects, a flight to sensible safety. I think it's fascinating when we look at some of the ways that we try and solve problems now. There's a ton of things that hold us back, because we're not permitted to think creatively. And as I look at the challenges we're facing, climate being a good example, we're going to need innovative thinking to solve these problems. But equally, I think that flight to safety brings other problems. It feels like a safe path, but actually it can generate risk of its own accord, as you point out.
I guess it's a bell curve, right? You've got most people in the middle who want reasonably predictable, safe lives, with the occasional little bit of tiny jeopardy thrown in just to keep life a bit spicy and fun. Then on the far right of the bell curve, you want people who want to eliminate all risk. Then on the far left of the bell curve, you've got people who routinely go and do insane things and kind of take risks and push the boundaries. And that, in any society, I assume that bell curve has got to stay in a reasonably sort of dynamic state, with all of those aspects kind of well covered. But there is a tendency, I think, at the moment to push people away into what you described, I think, as the sort of flight to safety and predictability.
Your book is very personal. So it's clearly a memoir of experiences. And one of the things I thought was really engaging was that you have some nice little anecdotes that, on the face of it, you would think, well, here's somebody that has dealt with some really big, thorny challenges who ought not to be faced by things. And there are some lovely moments in there where you display vulnerability is probably an unfair description of it, but you display a human capacity to sort of have things phase you. So I'm thinking, for example, of your tale of sort of passport control and what that does to you as you approach the immigration desk. And we've all been there, where it's sort of, what am I going to be asked? Have I filled the thing incorrectly? And what are the consequences? Am I going to be put back on the plane? Am I going to be arrested? All these sorts of things. And I found it's very endearing, but it's also fascinating to see that somebody that has dealt with big issues still has some of those human challenges that we all recognize.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one who, particularly in entering countries that are perhaps a little bit more authoritarian or stern in how they deal with these things, that I always fret that somehow I'm going to be arrested. And I know I look like a drug dealer. I know I sort of start to. I'm sure the sort of facial recognition cameras that are now populating airports are sort of a red blob is around me because I'm displaying all the characteristics of somebody who looks as if they're about to be revealed to be carrying vast quantities of narcotics in a false bottom of their suitcase or whatever. And evidently, I've never done that and never would. But there's something about that environment that makes me look shifty and undesirable. And why on earth would you let this person into your country? And I'm sure I'm not the only person who the environment stimulates a response that is wholly unnecessary and wholly uncalled for. But there is something about that sort of that triggers that kind of response in me. So when I was writing the book, I found myself wanting to talk about issues that are serious, issues that are in some cases kind of heartbreakingly awful, the kind of situations. And I talk very often, I think, about the kind of forgotten victims of rich people's conflict. So I talk about street children in Colombia. I talk about street children in Iraq. I talk about sort of people kind of left behind to pick up the pieces after the rest of us figuratively have kind of moved on. And yet at the same time, I do try to find some humor in these situations. And it's a delicate balance of trying my best to be as amusing as I can in parallel with, I hope, telling with some compassion how it's the people who are least able to defend themselves who carry the biggest burden of other people's crass mistakes. And I found that quite a hard thing to do. It's not for me to judge whether I do it successfully, but I didn't want to write a book that was just about all the bad things that happen in the world. And I didn't want to write just a flippant piece of kind of comic journalism. I wanted somehow to weave those two things together. In some ways to make the absurdity and the humor more stark, and also the opposite as well, to make other people's kind of suffering and victimization all the more evident as well. And there's one thing I talk about in the book, which I think some people find a bit controversial, and that's I spent a lot of time over my career in Iraq and looking, what is it now, since 2003, since the American-led invasion, and just the vast amounts of money that have been stolen in Iraq. Iraq's an inherently wealthy country. It has 5% of the world's oil production on a good day. It has a relatively small population. It should be an enormously wealthy country, or at least it should be a very strong middle-income country, given its natural resources and, as I say, a big country with relatively few people in it. And yet, all these years after the invasion, the job prospects for young people in Iraqi cities are appalling. They're trapped in a cycle of poverty. They're unable to break out of that. Very often, unable to get married because they don't have the economic prospects to enable marriage to happen in that culture to an extent. And they watch the fact that the natural wealth of their country has been stolen, and point the finger at how and by whom it's stolen. But the reality is it is. And their lives are very, very tough, and they're very frustrating. And to live in a country where the electricity supply is intermittent, live in a country where it routinely gets close to 50 degrees centigrade in the summer, and there's no air conditioning, there's no electricity, there's no jobs. And a recruiting sergeant turns up from a radical Islamic terrorist group and says, here's some photographs of Syrian and Iraqi children being killed by drones. Come with me, my friend. In a few hours' time, you can have a job, you can have a salary, you can have a wife if you're a man, and you'll be fighting the good cause. And I think mentioning the obligations of jihad for people is kind of secondary. the temptation to go and suddenly find a purpose in your life. And I think we don't look at that very often through that lens in the West. We look at terrorists on the television, or Islamic terrorists in the Middle East on the television, and because of the appalling things that happen, it's very easy for us to take a very binary view. These people are evil and they're doing terrible things to the world. On one level, that's absolutely true. But to dig down a level and say, why do these people do it? What motivated them? There's not 5 or 6 of them doing it. There are thousands of people doing this. There's got to be a reason. There's got to be a sociological, there's got to be a psychological reason why people choose to go and do this. And we do very little of that. We do very little of picking our way through the consequences of what's happened and why that decades later is still having horrible ramifications for people who weren't even born when the original harm was done.
It was one of the things that struck me reading your book and sort of thinking about your experiences is that clearly much of what you do, I mean, there are some things that we can say are not caused by humans, but even sort of natural disasters, you can make a climate change argument that then has a human cause. Yeah. So all of the things, generally speaking, that you're looking at have a serious human component in terms of causing them or making them going to move on. And I'm fascinated by that analysis around it's the environment that drives human decision making, as opposed to this narrative that we're all taught when we're younger, which is sort of there are good people and bad people. And in those children's fairy tales, it's very easy to identify which is which, and they're very, very black and white characters. And I'm fascinated your thoughts on, you touched there on what motivates and incentivizes people. But I'm sort of really fascinated by what you've seen in terms of how humans doing either really good things or really bad things, many of which will drive the business that you're in and the activities you're involved in. How do you sort of look at humans and the sense of what we do in the world and this good and bad labeling?
Well, it's a big question, and I don't know the answer to it, other than to say, in my experience, there are very few very bad, purely bad people, and there are very few purely good people. And I'm straying here into the work of psychologists that I'm not qualified to really comment on. But my sense of it, my observed sense over many years of watching kind of human behavior in extreme circumstances, my observed sense of it is that there are very few really truly evil people, and there are very few people who are purely good. And most of us sit on the spectrum in the middle. And whether the better or worse angels of our nature predominate is largely environmental. It's partly what is instilled into us as children by our parents and our school teachers. It's partly the sort of ethics and morals of social norms. But I think a lot of it is just the circumstances that people find themselves in. And I talk, I think, in the book about Brazil and about corruption in Brazil. And Brazil's by no means the most corrupt country in the world, and I wouldn't want to pick out Brazil as having that problem more than necessarily other countries, but it is a feature, has been a feature for the last several decades of Brazilian corporate life, and it's had some major scandals as a consequence, but talk about the process in which people become corrupt. And it's not that people sort of tick a box in the careers office at school and say, I would like to go on to be a corrupt business person or a corrupt politician. And some of them do. Some of them just don't care and just really don't care and willfully trying to feather their own nest at the expense of others. For a lot of people, it's a gradual process of behavioral change where the circumstances around making a small bribe to facilitate something with an official or a police officer or whatever seems, in the moment, inconsequential to society at large, seems to be an easily acceptable, excusable behavior on the basis that everybody else does it. And it's the gradation that then takes place that years later people find themselves occupying positions where they're giving and taking bribes And they have self-justified over the years based on this sort of accumulated sense of this is how this society works, and I can't fight it, I can't resist it, so I might as well be part of it. And that accounts for why most corruption and bribery takes place. Yes, on a grand scale, and quite rightly, people should and are be prosecuted. It's an appalling reverse distribution of income, where the money essentially gets taken from the poor and given to the very, very and often undeserving rich. That's how corruption kind of manifests itself, not the other way around. And yet the decisions by people to engage in that kind of activity are not as simple as people making a binary choice about being good or bad.
And I'm really intrigued by your sort of your career path. So you talked about how you came into that world and then obviously thoroughly enjoyed it and took stimulation from it. And you've now moved on into the coaching space. And it seemed to me that you would be an ideal candidate for moving into the world of politics with the understanding and the experience that you have. Is that something you'd ever considered about? And you know, what was driving your thinking when you came out of control risks into what you do next?
So I've never considered a career in politics. I'm fascinated by politics, and I'm fascinated by politicians, and have spent a lot of time in close proximity to politicians in different parts of the world. Some of them have astounded me with their extraordinary commitment and ability and drive and determination to make their countries better, and genuinely so. Met politicians in every country I've ever been to who fit that bill. I've also met politicians who are only in it to rob, steal, purloin, burgle as much as humanly possible whilst they've got their moment, their snout in the trough for as long as they can. And I've also met politicians who should not be allowed to use scissors unsupervised. So I think the combination of seeing that at close quarters for a very long time has probably ticked it off my list of something that I would never want to do. And I'm full of admiration for people who choose to do that. And I think more people need and should try and become representative politicians. It's a noble calling, and it needs sort of along with school teachers, it needs the best of us to kind of go and do that. But it's not for me.
But I mean, it just struck me that in a very insular world, and we're sort of very polarized, people with international experience who've seen the things that you've seen would be able to bring something very different to people that had perhaps, I worry hugely about these career politicians that have done nothing but run government bodies or quasi-government organizations. And that the breadth of experience that you've had would give you a different perspective. So much as you might not be minded to it, it does seem to me that some of what's missing in many of the solutions that we have is that broader perspective.
Yes, there's not much room in the modern political discourse for sort of nuance and ambiguity about how things really work. And I think I probably overdosed on nuance and ambiguity. And the process of trying to see the world by walking in other people's shoes, albeit briefly and vicariously, probably disqualifies me from having the kind of certainty about how the world works that many politicians need. And the choice to become an executive coach or a leadership coach is not because I have a blueprint from my own career of how to do it, far from it. Lots of experience, lots of scar tissue, lots of doing it wrong before I did it right, if I ever did. But it's more a fascination with what makes human beings behave as they do. And what we've talked about throughout this conversation, the importance of environment and context and the bearing that has on how people behave. And I am fascinated by that. And I'm fascinated by that, how that manifests itself in the business world of how people who aspire to and choose to lead organizations understand their own motivations, understand how other people see them, understand the context in which they're taking decisions, and the extent to which I can help provide them with the resilience to be able to lead organizations over an extended period of time. I'm always struck by the mantra that leadership is about leading from behind when things are going well. It's about leading from the front when things are going badly. And I think to the extent that I can help people sort of grapple with some of those sometimes counterintuitive imperatives for modern business, I'm thrilled to do it. And it's proving to be possibly the most rewarding and fruitful time of my life from a professional point of view. And it's probably helpful that I have had some of the experiences I've had. And I think what those experiences have left me long after the sort of geopolitical relevance has faded is hopefully an intrinsic appreciation of how difficult it is to make decisions. And you never have enough time. You never have enough information. There isn't a right or wrong answer. There's just the decision that you have to take, and you have to carry people with you. The process and everything that goes around that is what is an enduring fascination. And if I can help other people figure some of that stuff out, it's an absolute pleasure.
And you talked there about you having made mistakes. And I was sort of thinking, actually, when people in your previous life, when people called you in, it was very much to help them solve a problem. So you're in, and I could paint you as the fire brigade or whatever, but it's they could. And so this idea of sort of I've got a challenge. In many respects, there's an implicit expectation that you're going to get them out of the mess and fix this, and therefore possibly that you shouldn't be making mistakes because I'm paying you to. How did you handle making mistakes in that sort of environment and thinking around that when people have sort of hired you in as experts?
Well, what you're doing in that situation is you are enabling them to make a decision. And you are there in many capacities. You're there for reassurance. You're there as a sounding board. You're there to help provide some logical framework around which a decision can be made. But what you're very unlikely to be doing is turning up and saying, here's one I prepared earlier. I know the answer to your problem, because it's not going to be that easy. It's going to be very unique to those circumstances. But there is enormous advantage in having somebody who, whilst they won't have seen this particular problem, has seen analogous situations, has got some of the, if you like, the kind of grit under their fingernails of having watched analogous, similar processes take place, and to provide that kind of decision-making interaction. And the decision may end up being wrong, but it's being made in very good faith, and it's maximizing the chances of making the right decision and minimizing the chances of making the wrong one. It's not turning up. It's not turning up with a solution. That would be very difficult. I mean, when I say about making mistakes, I mean the book describes the sort of edited showreel highlights of a 30-year career. What it doesn't show is all the sort of painstaking process of actually running the business that I was involved in at Control Risks. And one of the things that also fascinates me is why we collectively make the wrong decision, why you get a group of people in a room and the decision could be, should we invest in this? Should we hire these people? Whatever it may be. And how we persuade ourselves of the virtue of doing the wrong thing. And then afterwards, sort of once the dynamic of the meeting is broken, individuals say, well, I was never sure that was the right thing to do, but everybody else seemed to think it was a good idea. And when everybody in the room comes out and says that, well, I'm not sure it's the right thing, but everybody else seemed to think it was, so I went along with it. What is going on in the collective psychology of that group of people to get them to make a nutty decision? And that fascinates me. And I'd like to think I can, in the work I do now, I can help people to occasionally puncture that balloon of groupthink that takes over organizations that are kind of making decisions, but getting swept along on the kind of collective false enthusiasm that they're picking up for other people for a decision that nobody actually really wants to make. And that is not an exaggerated sense of how it happens. That is happening all over businesses. As we're having this conversation, those decisions are being taken and people are secretly thinking, this is insane. I don't know why I'm agreeing to it, but everybody else is. And if in some small way I can help people stop and think and have the courage to call that out in the moment, that's great.
And it strikes me when you talk about corporate decision making that actually the factors we discussed before, the environment, the circumstance, are driving that decision making. It's not that people suddenly become stupid because they're sat in a particular room, but it's the process that we go through. It's the structure of meetings. I always talk about reading the minutes of the previous meeting feels like a really sensible approach because we're checking in with what we did last time. But on the other hand, you're setting the tone to be a repeat of the last performance. And I think lots of the ways that we have built corporate structures that look really good on paper don't reflect the realities of actually how we operate. And so I think in a way, when you talked about environments driving human decision-making, I think the same thing's true. And one of the things I think is really interesting, and if you don't want to go into politics, then maybe I can encourage this, is looking at some of the ways that we run companies and the processes that we go. In other words, the environment that makes those human beings do that. And rather than saying we've got a problem with the people, it's actually we're not equipping them to get the best out of themselves because we're putting them in situations where there will be a tendency to do what you've suggested.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I'm, again, years of sort of observed experience, I'm convinced that too many major corporations are now too large. They're too large for any kind of management structure to effectively manage sort of single brand, what is ultimately a single entity with one stock market listing and one board, just too big an organization for any. I mean, maybe there's an artificial intelligence algorithm that's about to arrive that's going to make all this possible for us. But for as long as we're relying on the fallibility of human judgment and human kind of intellectual capacity, I think too many organizations are far too large for that for there to be any effective measure of making sure that, broadly speaking, everybody knows what's going on and that the right decisions are being taken. And I think we live in an era where the cultish devotion to the CEO as an absolute monarch is insane. And I think that's a scourge in kind of international business. We attribute to fallible human beings extraordinary powers of kind of all-seeing omnipotence and ability. And we just know it's not true. Not to say there aren't really exceptional individuals who do amazing things and act as the catalyst for radical change in organizations. And I'm a firm believer that there are a very thin strand of some really exceptional people out there who have the ability to be able to articulate a different future for an organization in order to and take people with them. And that is an individual or a set of individuals that are able to do that. But the way we deify CEOs with the life they lead, they go from kind of investor conference to board meeting, back on the jet, back to sort of token visit to part of the organization, then back to another investor call, and we don't have that many absolute monarchs left in the world for a purpose. It's not a terribly good way to run countries. It doesn't tell truth to power. It inherently does the opposite. And I think that a lot of organizations that just have got themselves trapped in the kind of Henry VIII syndrome.
I love that. On a lighter note to finish us off, I can't let you go without getting a tip for us all. When the world opens up again, if you could pick one or two places that you would go to, where would you recommend? Where was the sort of most stimulating, possibly something that's not obvious that people might have been to before?
Well, one of the countries that I talk about in the book that I have enormous fondness for is Colombia in South America. And it's a country that's in broadly speaking, much better shape than it was a few years ago when it was a byword for the cocaine industry, for terrorism, for kidnapping, for all sorts of terrible things that beset that country. And it'd be wrong to say that Colombia is completely out of the woods. It's not Switzerland, it's not Sweden. But it is a country that has done a remarkable job against considerable adversity of pulling itself up by its bootstraps, helped by other countries in the process. But it's also a country of enormous diversity and beauty. And I spent many years going there. It's not the only country that I'm extremely fond of, but it's got a hinterland and it's got a backstory that is, at the end of the day, optimistic about our future.
Fabulous. I love that. We always need an uplifting note on which to finish. Thank you so much for being a really, really insightful guest on the podcast. And thank you for writing what is a cracking read that I will put links to in the show notes if people find. But I thoroughly recommend it. I enjoyed it. I learned some things from it, as I did our conversation. So thank you for both of those things.
No, my pleasure, Christian. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Richard for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Richard, his book, What on Earth Can Go Wrong, and his work on leadership, succession and career management, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. To find out more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients, visit human-risk.com. There you can find details of the Human Risk video channel, blog, and newsletter. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, please stay safe, control your risks, and thanks for listening.